Part 1. The night Helike disappeared. Imagine falling asleep in a city that has existed for hundreds of years. The streets are quiet. Lamps burn outside small houses. Ships rest in the harbor after another day of trade. Somewhere in the distance, people are still talking, drinking, and celebrating. Nobody knows that before the sun rises, their city will be gone. This was Helike. More than 2,000 years ago, on the northern coast of the Peloponnese, Helike was one of the most important cities in ancient Greece. It was wealthy, powerful, and famous far beyond its own borders. But Helike was more than just another Greek city. It was the center of a religious cult dedicated to Poseidon, the god of the sea. The people of Helike believed Poseidon protected them. His temple stood in the city, and his image appeared on coins. Travelers came to worship him. The city had a strong connection with the sea, and its harbor brought merchants, sailors, and travelers from distant parts of the Greek world. For generations, Helike seemed almost untouchable. Then came the winter of 373 BC. There had been warnings. According to ancient writers, strange things had happened in the days before the disaster. Animals reportedly began behaving strangely. Some were said to have left the city and moved toward higher ground. People could not have known what those signs meant. To them, an earthquake was simply a frightening possibility in a land where the ground often shook. But this earthquake would be different. It happened during the night. Without warning, the ground began to move. At first, people probably thought it was another earthquake. Then the shaking intensified. Walls cracked, roofs collapsed, columns broke apart. Entire buildings were thrown from their foundations. Imagine the chaos. People rushing into the streets in darkness, children screaming, families searching for each other, stone falling from buildings, dust filling the air, and beneath everything, the ground continuing to shake. The city had been struck by a catastrophic earthquake, but the earthquake itself was only the beginning. Helike stood close to the Gulf of Corinth, and the movement of the earth caused the sea to surge toward the city. A massive wave swept across the coastline. Water rushed through streets that had existed for generations. Homes disappeared. Temples were destroyed. The harbor was overwhelmed. Everything that the people of Helike had built was suddenly being swallowed by water, mud, and debris. The city was destroyed in a matter of hours. By the time the sun rose, Helike was no longer the city its inhabitants had known. Thousands of years later, we can only imagine what that morning looked like. The survivors would have looked toward the place where their homes had stood, but instead of familiar streets, they would have seen destruction. And somewhere beneath the water and mud were the remains of their city. Helike had vanished, but the strangest part of the story was still to come, because Helike did not simply become another ruined Greek city. It became a mystery. Ancient writers continued to talk about the city. Some described it as being beneath the sea. Others connected its destruction directly to the anger of Poseidon. And because the disaster was so complete, later generations could no longer easily identify where the ancient city had been. Centuries passed. Empires rose and disappeared. Rome conquered Greece. Rome itself eventually collapsed. Kings, kingdoms, and entire civilizations came and went. But Helike remained hidden. The city that had once been alive became a story told by historians, a real place that sounded almost like a myth. And this created a fascinating question. Was Helike actually beneath the sea? Or had the ancient writers misunderstood what happened? For hundreds of years, nobody knew. Part 2. The Lost City. As the centuries passed, Helike became one of history's great lost cities. People knew the name. They knew the story. They knew that a powerful earthquake and a devastating flood had destroyed it, but they could not find it. The mystery became even more fascinating because Helike had not been some tiny, forgotten village. It had been important enough to appear in ancient historical accounts. Travelers knew about it. Religious pilgrims knew about it. Merchants knew about it. And yet, the physical city had almost completely disappeared. Imagine how strange that is. You know a city existed. You know its name. You know that thousands of people once walked through its streets. You know temples stood there. You know ships arrived in its harbor. But when you travel to the region today, you cannot simply point to the ruins and say, "There it is." The landscape had changed. Earthquakes altered the ground. Rivers changed their courses. Sediment accumulated over centuries. The coastline itself was transformed. What had once been a recognizable city had become buried beneath layers of earth and water. For archaeologists, finding Helike became almost like solving a giant historical puzzle. And there was another problem. Ancient descriptions were not modern maps. They gave clues, but not precise coordinates. So researchers had to reconstruct the ancient landscape. Where was the coastline more than 2,000 years ago? Where did the rivers flow? How far inland did the sea reach? Where could a city of Helike's size have been located? For a long time, many researchers believed that the remains must be underwater. It seemed logical. Ancient writers had described the city as being swallowed by the sea. So archaeologists searched the waters of the Gulf of Corinth. But the answer was not so simple. Eventually, archaeological discoveries in the surrounding area began to change the picture. Researchers found ancient structures, pottery, coins, roads, and other remains buried beneath layers of sediment. The discovery suggested that Helike's story was more complicated than the simple legend of a city sinking into the sea. The earthquake had violently changed the landscape. The flood had buried parts of the settlement. Sediment had accumulated over the remains. And over thousands of years, nature had effectively hidden the city. This was one of the most important clues. Helike had not necessarily disappeared into a mysterious underwater world. It had been buried, and that makes the story even more incredible. Because the city was not destroyed, and then simply abandoned. It was transformed. The same forces that destroyed Helike also hid it. The earthquake shattered its buildings. The water carried debris across the settlement. Mud and sediment covered the remains. Then nature slowly rebuilt the landscape above them. Generation after generation passed. People built new settlements. They walked across the same region without realizing that an ancient city was lying beneath their feet. For more than 2,000 years, Helike waited underground, and perhaps that is the most haunting part of the entire story. The people who lived there believed their city would continue forever. They built stone temples. They created homes. They raised children. They traded with distant lands. They worshipped their gods. They lived ordinary lives. Nobody wakes up in the morning expecting to become part of an ancient legend. But the people of Helike did. Their final night became one of the most famous natural disasters recorded in ancient Greek history, and the city itself became a symbol of how fragile civilization can be. We often look at ancient ruins and imagine that civilizations disappeared slowly. We imagine wars lasting for years. We imagine kingdoms collapsing generation by generation. But Helike shows another possibility. Sometimes history can change in a single night. One moment, thousands of people are living their normal lives. The next, their homes are destroyed, their streets are flooded, and their city is buried. And thousands of years later, people are still trying to understand what happened. That is why Helike is more than just a lost city. It is a warning from the ancient world, a warning that no matter how powerful a civilization becomes, it is never completely safe from nature. The people of Helike built their city beside the sea. They worshipped Poseidon, the god who ruled it. They trusted their walls, their temples, their homes, and their way of life. But the sea that brought them wealth became part of their destruction, and the earth beneath their feet became their greatest enemy. Today, Helike is no longer simply a legend. Archaeological discoveries have brought parts of its story back into the light. But many questions remain. Exactly how many people died? How far did the water travel? What did the final moments look like? And how much of the ancient city is still hidden beneath the ground? We may never know every answer. Perhaps that is what makes Helike so fascinating, because somewhere beneath the modern landscape are the remains of a city that once believed it would stand forever. More than 2,000 years ago, Helike disappeared. But history did not forget it. History simply had to wait for someone to find it.